The Brown Pundits Browncast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the 10th episode in our series of podcasts on the history of the Indian subcontinent. My name is Maneesh, and in today's episode, we will talk about North India from the period which starts with the end of the Gupta age until about 700 AD. Joining me as speakers in this episode are Jayavardhan Singh and Gaurav Lele. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hi. Hello.
Welcome to the episode, gentlemen. Hi, Gaurav.
Hello.
Thank you, Manish.
Right. So let's get started. Gaurav, I'll start with you first. Plot for us the map of India at the end of the Gupta Empire, especially North India.
Right.
What does the political map of North India look like at the end of the Gupta Empire?
Yeah. Okay, let's start then. So this time I want to start from east because we have not covered east as much as we would have liked till now. So let's start with the northeast, which corresponds to the present day Assam. So a dynasty called Varman dynasty was ruling Assam at that time. So the kingdom is also called Kamarupa Varman dynasty. So this dynasty has a foundation myth which goes back to Narkasur, whose death we celebrate in the first day of Deepavali by Shri Krishna. So their origin goes back to them. So earliest, I think, first time they were mentioned is, if I'm not mistaken, Samudragupta's Prashasti, where the Varman dynasty is mentioned as someone who pays obeisance to Samudragupta. So they were there when the Guptas were having their empire, but they were there after the Guptas went as well. And the Varman emperor or king, he was also contemporary with the Emperor Harshavardhan. So who is sort of the last ancient Indian emperor of sorts. So that's Assam or northeast. Then when we go down to Bengal and Odisha part, there is a dynasty called Gaudas, and Gaudas took power after the fall of Guptas, and the famous king of the Gaudas is Shashank. We'll come back to him later, but just updating it. Then the region of Magad, it was ruled by a dynasty called in historical circles as later Guptas. So these later Guptas were probably Gupta administrators who were not related to the imperial Guptas, or they may be, but this is contested. That sort of thing. So the later Guptas were in Magad. Then north of Magad, in the original Gupta heartland of Uttar Pradesh, Prayag region, a dynasty called Maukharis, who were arguably the strongest empire or kingdom after the fall of Guptas, and their seat was Kannauj. And if I'm not mistaken, they used to call themselves Maharajadhiraj, which is what we translate as emperor or Chakravarti. So we come to Uttar Pradesh, then the MP Chhattisgarh region, there was a dynasty called Kalachuris. We don't know much about them, so I'll not go into any speculations. So just north of the Maukharis in the Haryana, Punjab, and maybe even eastern Uttar Pradesh region were the Pushyabhutis or Pushpabhutis. So this was a smallish kingdom, but after the rise of Harshavardhan, who is very famous, like which is a household name, that Pushyabhutis became a empire of sorts, which covered the entire North Indian uh, part of the country. Then a short empire in the central Indian plains after the time of Guptas are Aulikaras. So in the previous episode also we mentioned about Aulikaras who helped defeat the Hunas, but they probably were very short lived and we don't know much about them after that, apart from a couple of inscriptions. So Jay can correct me if I'm wrong. Then coming west, in the South Gujarat region, there was a long-lived dynasty called as Maitrakas, So they were apparently lunar dynasty Kshatriyas, and their capital, Vallabhi, was also a famous city which had a famous university for those times. So we come to Gujarat, and then apart from that, in the western region of the country or subcontinent, there was a dynasty called Chachas in Sindh, who had taken power from the Persian Empire, the Sasanian Empire, just around this time. Then I think small kingdoms of the Gurjarats in the Rajasthan Gujarat region also existed. And according to Kalhan in Rajatarangani, there was a dynasty called Gondana dynasty, but scholars are still not sure whether that dynasty existed or not. So everything after the Gondana dynasty is generally agreed upon as historical, and the first two dynasties mentioned by Kalhan in Rajatarangini are not believed. So that is sort of the rough outline. Apart from that, some Central Asian kingdoms of sorts of Hunas and maybe some remnants of Kushanas maybe still continued in the region corresponding to modern Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir, but we don't know much about them apart from a few coins here and there. So in short, it's a very diverse map, and yeah, no big ruler per se. The Mokharis from UP or Gangetic Plain were arguably the strongest of these.
So a very fragmented map. So there wasn't
Yeah.
any large kingdom that succeeded or large empire or dynasty that succeeded the Guptas. Jay, coming to you, any comments on what Gaurav just said? And also, what is our source of information about this period?
Okay. About the political map, I think I will just, briefly elaborate on what Gauravji had just said. So what we see is that the last great Gupta king was Narsimhagupta, and around the first half of 6th century AD, he dies. And what we see is that the last inscription about the Guptas, and which was issued by the imperial Guptas, dates to around 543 AD. And after that, we see that there are no, great inscriptions of the imperial Guptas. And it was during this period we see that the invasion of the Hunas, particularly by Mihir Kula, happened. And Mihir Kula was defeated in Malwa region by three different personalities. First was the Gupta ruler himself, and second, the two were their feudatories. So first was Ishan and the second was Yashodharman. And what we see is that after defeating Mihirkul, now what happens is that this Yashodharman, who belongs to the Aulikaras, now he assumes somewhat of an independent status. And what we see is that there is only one inscription about Yashodharman. This is in Mandsaur. Mandsaur is close to the Rajasthan border in MP. So in Mandsaur, we have one inscription of Yashodharman, and here you can see how he claims that he has conquered the lands up to the Himalayas, and in east up to the Brahmaputra river, and west up to the seas. So that this is how he describes his empire. But that was not true. And what we see is that about the Aulikaras particularly, the rise of the Aulikaras happened with Yashodharman, and after his death, the Aulikaras also disappeared from history. So around 540 AD, we see that the Aulikaras have disappeared. Now about the Maitrikas, because let's start with the Maitrikas, because the Maitrikas, like Gauravji has just said, they are the first rulers of the Maitrikas, or first rulers which we know of from the inscription, were not independent rulers. They were Gupta feudatories. For example, the first ruler which is mentioned in the Maitrika inscription was a person called Bhattarak. And we are told that Bhattarak was a Gupta general, and he was the governor of Saurashtra or Kathiawar region. And but what we see is that, since I have talked about how in the 6th century, particularly first half of 6th century, we see that the decline of the Gupta, imperial Gupta is happening. So what we are seeing basically is that the Samantas or feudatories of the Gupta Empire have now, started assuming independent status. So the Maitrikas were one, and Gaurav has talked about their capital. Now, one interesting point about the Maitrikas is that there were 4 sons of Bhattarak, and there is we historians are sure of the fact that the first 3 sons all became kings. So we see that the eldest son was a person called Dharsingh, and he becomes king. And after him, there is a person called Drona Singh. He also becomes the king. And after we have a Dhruv Singh, so he becomes. So this is a peculiar aspect of the Maitrikas that brothers are becoming king one by one. So this is about the Maitrikas. And in the Gurjar of Rajasthan, now there is this debate in the historical circle whether these Gurjars are, what this Gurjar term suggests. Some scholars believe that these were, name given to the residents of Gurjar Desh. So Gurjar Desh is the region which presently, is roughly corresponds to some parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat. So this is one theory, and some argue that the present people of which are known as Gurjar, these were the descendants of the present descendants of the Gurjars. So this is multiple theories, but what is interesting about the Gurjars of Rajasthan is that their center was in the Jodhpur region, and here also we see that the first ruler where we start getting inscription is around the middle of 6th century. So basically, the same story happening in here is also that the decline of Gupta is happening, and these rulers, which were earlier part of the, they were vassals of the Gupta Empire. Now they were assuming independent role. And about the mockeries, same here also we see that they were earlier feudatories. And the main important ruler of the mockeries was a person called Ishanavarman. And we are not sure about the exact date of Ishanavarman, but Ishanavarman most likely ruled around 554 AD. And the mockeries covered the region of modern UP. So this is the modern UP. And about Ishanavarman particularly, what we see is that in his inscription, which was found in the region of Jaunpur, which is in eastern UP, he talks about the part of the inscription which is eligible, which is, we can read it. It tells us that the phrase is quite poetic. So it talks about, the spark from Dhara. So Dhara is the region of Malwa region, which was controlled by Yashovarman. So it appears that Yashovarman tried to push into the mockery territory, but Ishanavarman defeated him. And east of the mockeries, we see that the later Guptas are ruling. Later Guptas are also, this term later Guptas is different from the imperial Guptas, as Gaurav ji has talked about. And even in the inscriptions of the later Guptas, there is no claim. They don't claim that they were descendants of the imperial Guptas. They were perfectly aware of the fact that they had a separate existence. So now, interestingly, the mockeries and the imperial Guptas, they have this rivalry that is going on. Now, east of the Guptas, we have the region of Bengal. Now, here I would like to, just say that the Gauda is a region. It is not a dynasty. So most of the time, when we talk about the Gauda king. So here, basically they are telling us that this king ruled the Gauda region. So Gauda region is basically the present Western Bengal region, and east of the Gauda region is the present day Bangladesh. It's called Vanga. So in the Gauda region, we see that the later Guptas had control over this region, And after the uh, after the decline of the Guptas, later Guptas particularly, it was around the end of 7th century. We see that here Shashank of God rises. He was earlier a vassal of the Guptas, later Guptas. Now, uh, another important dynasty which will play an important role is Pushyabhutis. Gaurav ji has talked about them. Their center was the city of Thaneshwar or Sthaneshwar, which is in the Kurukshetra region. And here also we see that the earlier inscription that dates back to around 500 to 580 AD. So here they talk about these three kings, which were basically the feudatories of the Guptas, or some scholars believe that the Hunas, they were feudatories of the Guptas or the feudatories of the Hunas. And it was only with the third ruler, whose name is Aditya Vardhan, that we see the Pushyabhutis have achieved an independent status. Now Aditya Vardhan was the grandfather of Harshvardhan.
Right. So just tell me, Jay, you've been mentioning the word inscriptions. So what are these inscriptions and where do we find them? Is that our primary source of information about this era?
Yes, because here there are basically, when we talk about the sources, we have first the source of Chinese traveler Xuanzang. Now Xuanzang, travels at a later period at the start of 7th century. But for the 6th century, we have only the inscriptions. And most of the time, these inscriptions are either land grants. So a particular ruler is giving land to a particular to a group of brahmanas or to his officers. So that is how we know that that this ruler was ruling in a particular period. And some interesting aspect about land grants is that in some land grants, we find that genealogy of the ruler is also mentioned. So that is how we could construct a certain history. But the fact that we have only inscriptional evidence, and that too of a certain kind, means that our date is not exact. So that is why most of the time we have rough estimates, and the region or the which territory was which these rulers were ruling is also quite is debatable.
Right. And what language are these inscriptions in?
Sanskrit.
Right. So we know about this era primarily from inscriptions found in northern India and in the Gangetic plains. These inscriptions are primarily in Sanskrit. Then we also know about this era from writings of various foreign travelers who came to the subcontinent in this period, and especially this part of the world in this period. Right. One of the things that we've discussed in the earlier episodes is this: by the time we are talking of this era, by this time, there are three major religions at play in this part of the subcontinent. Prominent being what is now known as Hinduism. Then there is a large Buddhist influence, and then there is Jainism. And the rulers were not followers of any one particular religion, and even if they were, there was patronage given to all religions. So how, now that the polity is fragmented, now that there are so many kingdoms instead of one large unified kingdoms, Gaurav, what is the religious interplay in the subcontinent at this point of time?
Yeah, so one thing which we understand, especially from the land grants which Jay talked about, was that most of the rulers of this era, as well as the previous era, were devotees of Shiv. So some sort of we can say they followed some sort of Shaivism. Vaishnavism, which was the Gupta faith, that seems to be not that popular as Shaivism was. So Harshvardhan himself was a devotee of Shiva, and so were the Maitraka rulers. So Nandi, the coins of these times, I think Nandi makes an appearance on most of the coins. So Rishabh or Nandi, whatever, like we want to see a bull. So that is one thing. But But that being said, many rulers continued to be patrons of Buddhism. So even the Maitraka rulers, a lot of funding went into Buddhism. The Vallabhi University, which we talked about, that apparently had a lot of Buddhist monks who came there for study and so on and so forth. Then in the eastern part of the country, in the Magad region, Nalanda, Vikramshila, Udanpuri, I may be misspeaking name of one of these universities. So these universities also housed a lot of Buddhist monks. So Buddhism was still there, but this also, in my opinion, appears to be the time when Buddhism sort of began vanishing from the subcontinent. So by the time of Islam, by the time of invasion of Islam, we know that Buddhism was largely restricted to the east and the west region of the country, and the main heartland of the even the Gangetic North heartland and Punjab and all these regions probably did not have much influence of Buddhism. So is true for South India. So why, maybe at a later point we can discuss that. Apart from that, Jainism also, this was also an important time for Jainism. So we talked about the Vallabhi University, which was funded by the Maitrakas. So a Jain council took place over there, and some of the schisms in Jainism also apparently go back to this time. Then the Jaina famous Jain text called Kalpasutra was also probably compiled during this time. So that is one way of looking at it. Another thing, for religions per se, so we talked about the ruler of Gaud, Shashank. So he is one of those alleged kings who persecuted Buddhists. So a lot of Buddhist sources paint him as a devil of sorts. So a lot of stories about how he tried to burn the monasteries in Magad when he conquered Magad, so on and so forth. There is also a Buddhist tale about how he tried to burn the Bodhi tree under which Buddha got enlightened. So a lot of allegations are made against Shashank for being a persecutor of Buddhists. But surprisingly, his own kingdom, like the Bengal region, there seems to have not been much persecution of Buddhists, if any. If any, persecution was limited to the Magad region, which he was conquering. And he continued, maybe, so some sources, some scholars claim that he continued to patronize Buddhism in his own kingdom while persecuting it outside, but we cannot be sure.
Right. Jay, your thoughts on the religious dynamic?
I think I don't have much to add on this, but about the Buddhism particularly. In this period, what we see is that when we look at the archaeological records, is that monasteries are coming up, and yeah, even those monasteries that were present earlier, they are, the size of them are increasing, particularly, at the period of 7th or 8th century we are talking about. So that is one aspect. And another aspect about Jainism, when we read the early Jain sources, particularly those of post-modern era or the early Gupta eras, or whatever sources which we believe are the earliest Jain sources, scholars believe. So what we see is that the region of Western India, particularly, the region of Sindh and some parts of Rajasthan, earlier it was believed that, a Jain monk uh, shouldn't go there because it was considered a uh, the term which is used is Malikcha or it was close to the Malikcha. But what we see is that now, the shift of Jain religion and Jain tradition is happening towards the west. So so now, as Gauravji has said, that, the city of Vallabi has, started to become an important center for the Jain religion. And what we see is that by the time of 7th or 8th century, this restriction of Jain monks has suddenly disappeared. Now it is okay for Jain monks to be or to, roam around in this region.
Right, right. Gaurav, you mentioned universities coming up, which had these large, where these Buddhist monks would study. What do we know about some of the earliest universities and some of the universities or centers of learning or higher education that evolved in this part of the country at that time? Do we know anything about them?
So I think the earliest, the title of the earliest university per se goes to Takshashila, but I'm quite sure by this time period, Takshashila had already declined. Jai can correct me if I'm mistaken. So it was no longer a university per se. So this Vallabhi University, which I talked about, this is a fascinating place. So from the sources, especially the Jain sources, we can say that a lot of quote unquote secular traditions or secular learning also took place over there. So when we say the kings were these universities are Buddhist or Jain, but that doesn't mean that followers of Shaivism or Vaishnavism were not there. So those traditions also found some space over there, and also the secular traditions like what people then back then understood as science or Ayurveda, these things were also taught over there. So that's about the Vallabhi University. The Nalanda University particularly is very famous. Apparently, it had 200 teachers or so, and some estimates. I think Xuanzang himself says that around 10,000 or so students were there at a time. So, for some, I have not actually read much about the other universities in the east, Vikramshil and Udanpuri, or what's the name? I think Udanpuri is the name. So I think there is also some confusion in popular culture about which university Bakhtiyar Khilji burned. So I think the evidence for Udanpuri is more strong than Nalanda. But I mean, I'm digressing here. So maybe Jay can add something about these universities.
Jay, what do we know about Nalanda University? What are its origins? Around what time it started? Your thoughts, your comments on that.
About the Nalanda University, we are not sure whether uh, by who was the main ruler that established this university, but most scholars are of the opinion that by the end of 6th century AD, this university had come into being. And what we see is that now even after the end of the Guptas, these later kingdoms that had emerged after the Gupta decline, they also continued to support this. Uh, about the Nalanda University, especially, interestingly, what we see is that there were also the what Gauravji talked about, that the region of Bihar, because the Udanpuri University, Vikramshila, although I think was not, is in Western Bengal right now. I'm not sure
Right,
about
right.
that. But the region of Bihar especially, this was the place, where we see a lot of uh, small or large monasteries are coming up. And that is how, the present name Bihar, it comes from uh, the, the name Bihar. So this region, especially, the eastern region, it had become a center of Buddhist learning particularly. And that is what we see when Xuanzang comes here. He reports that, how this region has lots of monasteries and monks which are still present. And especially these monasteries, particularly, it was because of the imperial Guptas and the late imperial Guptas that that is they patronized them heavily, because what we see is that the early Gupta rulers were, patrons of, they supported more the Vaishnav religion. But by the time of the later imperial Guptas, we see that they have become more and more Buddhist. So there is this, what we see is that when the Guptas were increasing, they were supporting the Vaishnav religion, and when they were declining, they were supporting the Buddhist religion. So that is, an interesting way to look at this.
Right. So we know in this, when we are the time period that we are talking of, which is 5th to 7th century AD, Nalanda already existed. It had a large student community, and it was patronized by the later Guptas and the kingdoms that were ruling that part of the country right now. Just for our listeners, the present location of where the modern Nalanda University is coming up. The original Nalanda University was also in this part of the country. Jay? Gaurav, your thoughts?
I'm not exactly sure where the current Nalanda University is coming up. So yeah, so you can
So
maybe.
where was the original Nalanda University? Which part of the country was the original Nalanda University?
So in the Magad region, in eastern Bihar.
Right. So the present day Nalanda University that's coming up, that's also coming up in Bihar. It's coming up in a place called Rajgir.
Yeah, so Rajgir is the imperial capital of the first Magadhan kingdom of
Right.
Bimbisara.
Now,
So we,
uh,
yeah,
it was
yeah,
in
Jay.
the region is Bihar, and particularly south of the river Ganga. That is certain. But I have this confused. I don't know whether the university is right close to uh, the archaeological site of the Nalanda University. That I'm not sure, because
No.
the Raj.
That's fine. That's fine. This was just a general digression. Right. This is also a time when we know now that there are large kingdoms coming up south of the Vindhyas. What do we know about the interaction of those kingdoms, the Chalukyas, the Pallavas, or if there was any interaction with the kingdoms north of Vindhyas, especially some of
Mm,
these kingdoms? What do we know about that interaction?
yeah, so I think Shrikant and Mukunda touched about that in the previous episode. So the Chalukyas were the predominant power in the south at this time, along with the Pallavas. So we know for sure that Pulakeshin and Harshvardhan, so they faced off around Narmada in the early part of the 7th century. So this seems to have been triggered by the smaller kingdoms around the Narmada region. So like the Latas, maybe Gurjaras, and some other kingdoms around the Gujarat MP region, who Harshvardhan also wanted under his control, or to pay obeisance to him, to accept his suzerainty, and they sort of accepted Pulakeshin's suzerainty, and this caused I mean, some historians, among them a historian from Bhandarkar, Srinanda Bapat, so he and some others have this opinion that these sort of conflicts caused the uh, war, so to speak, between the ruler, the great emperor Harshvardhan of north, and Pulakeshin. But apparently Pulakeshin defeated, or at least held Harsha to a stalemate around Narmada, and then I think they had sort of peace after that. But yeah,
Jay, your thoughts?
that
Uh, so what we basically see is that mainly from the north, there were attempts by Harshvardhan particularly to conquer parts of southern India, and particularly we are talking about south of the Narmada. And apart from this, the fact that this period was a period when we see large fragmentation is happening. There was no single empire. So this made a connection between these two regions difficult. Although it is true that uh, particularly this was the period, what we see is from the northern region, and particularly from the region of middle country, which is in Sanskrit it is called middle country, Madhya Desh. So Madhya Desh is the region from Haridwar to Prayag. So from here, what we see is that Brahmans are migrating, and they are migrating with their families. And these migration, can be migrating Brahmanas are settling in Odisha, are settling in different parts of the country, and even in the south. So this is an important aspect, which is which talks about how these this migration of Brahman and the cultural interaction which happened because of this migration. It's an important aspect of this period.
Yeah, so many of the South Indian Brahmin families, so they have their histories, and I think they go back most probably to like this time, like 5th, 6th, 7th century, when the southern rulers, may they be Pallava, Rashtrakutas, or like even the Chalukyas, so to s- they sort of gave land grants to northern Brahmins, particularly from the urban centers. And so as Jay mentioned, so all the family histories of the southern Brahmins go back to that time. So yeah, that's an
Right,
important point.
right, right. So we've been talking of this gentleman for a while now, and he is probably the most famous figure of this era. Let's talk about Harshvardhan. Uh, Jay, why don't you start with, since you mentioned his grandfather a little while back, why don't you start with the kingdom that he belonged to and what is the origin of that kingdom and a little bit of a backstory of his family?
So the Pushyabhutis, as they were called in the inscriptions, I have said that their center was the region of Thaneshwar or Thaneswar. And what we see is that the
So
first
I'll just,
three.
Jay, I'll just interrupt you there. So this Thaneshwar that you're talking of is the present day Kurukshetra, which is
Northern Haryana.
northwest of Delhi. Right. Please carry on.
So what we see is that the first three in the inscription, we have the first three rulers, and these rulers are most likely the feudatories of the either the Gupta emperor or the Huna king. And these three rulers ruled from 500 AD to 580 AD. And it was in the this third ruler of the Pushyabhuti dynasty, whose name is Adityavardhan. And Adityavardhan marries a later Gupta princess. And with this marriage, what we see is that this dynasty has suddenly gained a lot of influence, and that is why we see that they had started using the term Maharaja Dhiraj in their inscriptions. So whenever this term appears, Maharaja Dhiraj, so there is this assumption which historians may make that now a particular kingdom or a particular ruler has assumed independence from their vassals, from their feudatory lords. So this is the case with Adityavardhan as well. So the son of Adityavardhan was a person called Prabhakar Vardhan, and he had two sons, Rajyavardhan and Harshvardhan. And the region which Prabhakar Vardhan ruled was basically the region of Haryana, some portions of Rajasthan, and some portions of UP, particularly Western UP. So basically, the region of south of the Satluj River and Punjab also, some south of the Satluj River, west of Yamuna, and in the west of the Yamuna, and around the Jaipur region. So basically, the north of Delhi. So this was the location which the Pushyabhutis ruled. So we see, Prabhakar Vardhan has these two sons, and what happens is that Prabhakar Vardhan, Rajyavardhan was to become the next ruler of the
Sorry to
Pushyabhutis.
interrupt, Jay. Maybe you can just add a bit about the source of these or everything which you are saying, which is an interesting story.
Okay, now I had intended to end the story with this. So the main source from which we know is Bana's Harshcharitra. And the Bana's Harshcharitra is important because, the origin myth which we see in the Bana's Harshcharitra is quite, different from what we see in the inscriptional sources. So anyway, what we see is that Prabhakar Vardhan tells us that Rajyavardhan to go on a campaign against the Hunas. And Rajyavardhan goes, And when he was in a later stage against this in this campaign, he suddenly receives the message from the capital that his father is dying, and he leaves. He abandons this campaign and he rushes back to the capital. And when he reaches the capital, what he sees that his father has already died and his mother has committed sati. So Ban in his Harsha tells us that because of this, that both his parents have died. Uh, Rajyavardhan wanted to abandon all of this, what we say in Hindi Rajpat, and become ascetic. He said to his younger brother, whose name was Harshvardhan, that you become the next king. So Ban tells us that because of this renunciation, this feeling of renunciation that that has appeared in Rajyavardhan. Harshvardhan also said that I will not be the next king. I am also going to become a ascetic. Now, incidentally, when this conversation is going on between these two brothers, another messenger comes, and this messenger tells us that the mockery ruler has been killed by the Malwa king. Now, here the mockery ruler is important for the Pushyabhutis is because Prabhakar Vardhan has also a daughter whose name is Rajyashri. So Rajyashri was the sister of these two brothers. And because Rajyashri was married to a mockery ruler, so what we see is that now the mockery ruler is dead, and we are told that this Malwa king, whose name is Devagupta, and Devagupta has also captured Rajyashri. So because so the fact that their sister has been captured by the Malwa king, Rajyavardhan decides to avenge this folly that this Malwa king has committed. So he rushes to Kannauj, which was the center of the mockeries, and here he easily defeats the Malwa king. But according to Ban, Malwa king has an ally whose name is Shashank of God. This was the ruler of Bengal. So he somehow lures Rajyavardhan for a meal, and we are not sure how Prabhakar Vardhan dies, but he is eventually murdered. And because Rajyavardhan is murdered, we see that now the next Pushyabhuti ruler is Harshvardhan. So Harshvardhan, in order to avenge the death of his his brother, and also to avenge the death of his brother-in-law, he goes to the Kannauj region. And for him, the main priority is not to defeat Shashank, because what he finds is that his sister Rajyashri, he is missing, and we are told that in Bana's Harcharit that she is in the Vindhya forest. Now, the story in Bana Harcharit tells us that finally, when whole of this searching is going on, eventually Harshvardhan finds his sister Rajyashri, and that is how this is the last part of Bana's Harcharit. Now, historians believe that the fact that for Harshvardhan, defeating Shashank was not that important. For him, finding Rajyashri was important because Rajyashri had no sons. So, in order to become the ruler of Kannauj region as well as the Thaneshwar region, he needed to have Rajyashri close to him. And there is also this connection which Ban makes in his Harcharit, that Rajyashri is somehow equated with Rajya Lakshmi. So Rajya Lakshmi is the sovereignty goddess of Shri Lakshmi, sorry. which is a goddess of sovereignty. So just like, there is this allegory that when Harshvardhan finds his sister Rajshri, he also found the Sri Lakshmi. So it is quite interesting allegory, but eventually what we see is that the region of Thaneshwar and the region of Kannauj has become a single kingdom that is now being ruled by Harshvardhan.
So we know all this from Bana's Harshcharitra.
Yeah. So
And
one
what
of the
language is this? And what language is this book composed in?
Sanskrit.
Right.
So
Sorry,
one
go
of the
ahead.
fascinating things about this is like this is one of the earliest biographies of sort from India, and it is very detailed. And so we passed over so many emperors in this podcast, from Ashok, about whom we know a lot because he had a lot of inscriptions. But all the other all the other rulers about whom we have talked, apart from a few prashastis, a few inscriptions, and maybe a coins, all the sources are later sources, or not very, not sources which were very close to the king. But about Harshvardhan, because Banabhatta was his own poet of sorts, so we know a lot actually. Maybe it is a bit of a propaganda because he was patronized by the ruler himself. But even with that, the amount of information we have about Harshvardhan is really astounding, like magnitudes higher than all other kings till now. And what we talked about, this story which Jay just mentioned, so it would make a Game of Thrones sort of story. This mockery, Sashank, Pushyabhuti, these power struggles, the finding of Harshavardhan's sister, like it makes great television or great storytelling, many things. So
Right, right. So let's
I
come
think Jay
back to
wanted to say
the
something.
let's come back to the protagonist of this 2B series, which is Harshvardhan. So now we know that his father's dead, and now he takes the throne after his elder brother. How does he go about ruling this? So what's the political map of his kingdom like? What's the western border? What's the eastern border? What's the southern border? And what's the northern border of his kingdom?
So I think I have a little comment to make about Bana's Harshcharit. So Bana's Harshcharit end with Harshvardhan finding Rajshri. So after this, the story ends. So the actual reign of Harshcharit is not covered by Bana. So I think that is an important point, because in the mind of in the mind of Harshcharit, the main act was, there is this which we can argue is that for him he wanted to justify how he got the kingdom of Kannauj. So that is how. So basically, if we are being cynical, Bana's Harshcharit is a propaganda for Harshvardhan to legitimize his rule over the Kannauj region. So I think this is about Bana's Harshcharit. And
right,
about Harsha's empire, what we see is that when he becomes the ruler of these two kingdoms, he goes on a campaign, which in some sources is described as Digvijay. So incidentally, when Ban meets him, so Ban meets him when he is on a campaign. So that is how this story starts, of how Ban met Harshcharit and how he started writing Harshcharit. Sorry. So what we see is that the first campaign he directed towards the west, particularly the Maitrikas and the Gurjaras. And here he did not met any great success. Some area he was able to conquer, but there was no success. In the Chalukya case, we have already discussed that his attempt to cross the Narmada failed. And interestingly, earlier it was believed that this battle happened between around 630 to 640. But recently there is this copper plate which Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, Bori, has found. So in this from this copper plate, we can be pretty sure of the fact that this battle between Pulakeshin II and Harshvardhan happened around 640 1618 to 1619. So in the winter season, this battle happened. So basically, if you are going to cover the region of Harshvardhan, we are basically talking about he ruled the region of Eastern India and up to the region of Haryana, and in the south, Narmada was his boundary. Now there are some scholars who would claim that the whole northern India was controlled by Harshvardhan, but the problem is that Xuanzang's account tells us that he describes the kingdom of the Maitrikas as independent of the of Harshvardhan. Same is true for the Kashmir region as well. But incidentally, we have this, in Kalhan's Raj Tarangini, we are told that Harshvardhan wanted to, worship the relic of Buddha's tooth. So he ordered the king of Kashmir, where this relic was located, to deliver this relic to him, so that he could worship this relic. So this shows that there was some the ruler of Kashmir was some type of a subordinate ruler, but not exactly a vassal. So this is the basic broad. Basically, we are talking about Eastern India was controlled by him. The region of Odisha, Bengal, Kamrup was not. The ruler of Kamrup was his ally, and up to the region of Haryana.
But in
south.
the east, I think Jay, till Shashank was alive, I think he still had some control over the Bengal and Orissa region. Only after his death did Harsh sort of have ownership of that region, right?
Yes, there is this confusion. Most scholars believe that the confrontation between Shashank and Harsh never took place. But we are not sure. But what we can say is that around 620 AD, Shashank dies. And after him, there is no great successor of his. And Harshvardhan was able to claim this territory. But Gaurav is right about the fact that, earlier Bengal was not included. Bengal became later. Bengal became later the, territory of Harshvardhan. And incidentally, we can also get a sense of how Harshvardhan ruled his territory from Xuanzang's account. Xuanzang tells us that the king is always on the moving. So sometimes he goes on a hunt. So whenever he is hunting for 2 or 3 months, and he is hunting in different regions of his realm. So the main purpose was to check on the vessels and also how the territories are being kept.
Right. Gaurav, your thoughts on the political map and how Harsha went about expanding the Pushyabhuti Empire?
Yeah, so I think on the political part, I think I will not add anything beyond that. One thing interesting is that some recent scholars have started looking at Harshvardhan, especially the later part of his life, as a great patron of Buddhism, mostly from Xuanzang's account. So a lot of scholars these days believe that though Harshvardhan started as a Shaivite, he ended his life as a great patron of Buddhism, not only a great patron of Buddhism, but also a personal devotee of Buddhism, so to speak. But yeah, there is still some, like it is contested, but that is one thing. So in popular imagination, he is looked upon as a great Hindu ruler, but there is some doubt about it, especially towards the later part of his death. And also interestingly, some scholars have started like I am not convinced about it, but there is a lot of scholarship these days, so I think we have to mention that Harsha in some way was responsible for the death of his brother. That is one allegation that has been put these days, but yeah, I don't think it is quite supported to that extent. Also, one thing, we will come to Xuanzang later, but Harsha had diplomatic relations with the great Tang emperor. So I think 3 or 4 emissaries from Harsha to Tang emperor and Tang emperor back to Harsha exchanged. So that is a fascinating thing to know. And I think the
So,
Kumbh
Gaurav,
Mela.
Gaurav, I'll
Yeah.
just stop you there. So what you're saying is Harsha was sending emissaries to China,
Yes.
and
To
emissaries
and
were coming
fro.
from China.
Yes. So he had like officially diplomatic relations with the Tang Emperor at that time.
Right, right.
Yeah. And one more thing, I think the Kumbh Mela, which we like, which is very popular. So I'm not quite sure whether Harsha started it or it probably goes back to time before Harsha. But that was sort of a big thing uh, during Harsha's rule. So maybe Harsha had some role to play into what the Kumbh Mela became. And
Then
also from
Gaurav, just for our listeners, which Kumbh are we talking of? The one that happens in Allahabad or Prayag, or the
yeah,
one that
the
happens in Ujjain?
Prayag one.
Prayag. Okay, right.
Right, Jay, or am I mistaken? Maybe let me just cross check.
That's very interesting. The origins of Kumbh Mela, or at least the recorded history of Kumbh Mela, right? Jay, what do you know
Not
about?
origins, maybe it was patronized or maybe expanded by Harsh.
Right, right, right. Jay, what do we
Yes,
know about Kumbh Mela and linkages with Harshvardhan?
and one thing I will about the Kumbh Mela itself. When you go to Prayag city, when you enter this the region where Kumbh Mela happens on the banks of in the Sangam region. So what we see is that there is this great, beautiful murti or statue of Harshvardhan.
Right.
We are
So
told that
he was one of the early patrons of the, at least one of the earliest patrons we know of the Prayagraj Kumbh.
Recorded, yeah, yeah.
Fascinating.
Or at
Right,
least it might have gone like it might have scaled up during Harsha's time. So
right.
that we can say it may have existed before. And one more interesting thing, like so there are a lot of tales about Harsh, how he was a great emperor, how every 5 years he used to empty his treasury and sort of give it away to everyone. So one of the primary sources, apart from the Banabhatta's biography, is Xuanzang. So I'm not maybe pronouncing the name right, but he has written extensively, I think, about Harshvardhan.
Right. So we'll come to Hyun Sang. I hope that's how it's pronounced. But one of the things I read about Harshvardhan was he was a great patron of theater, performing art, plays. He was also apparently a playwright. What do we know
Yeah.
about that aspect of his life?
he wrote a text called Ratnavali, and there is this other text which I forgot. But some scholars have there is this debate whether he actually wrote this play or not. So,
But
but
was he a patron of this sort of art? Was he a patron of theater, play as a performing art? Do we know anything about that? Gaurav, have you read anything?
Yeah, apart from the like attribution of these three plays, not much. So we don't know like whether there were large amphitheaters built or something on along those lines. But especially from the time of Samudragupta, I think this multifaceted personality of an emperor that seems to have become popular with the Indian rulers. So they just were not happy to have the might of the sword. So they also wanted to be great musicians, great poets, great artists, so on and so. So maybe that is a callback to that.
Right,
Harsha
right,
being a great playwright.
right, right. Coming back to the most prominent Chinese to have visited India, or one of the Chinese who visited India, and we all read about him in our history textbooks in schools, is Hyun Sang. Uh, my apologies if that's not how it's pronounced, but that's how I was taught. What do we what do we know about him? Do we know anything about his backstory? Uh, what did he write about?
So
so
as far as yeah, okay, Jay, you can go on, Jay.
uh, so Huan Sang, as Gaurav here talked about, he was sent by the Tang Emperor, and he spent
I think there is some conflict there. Huh? Some of the biographies I think mention that he asked the Tang Emperor to go and he was denied permission. So he sort of he escaped from the king and he actually risked his life. So the journey, the route we take, the Silk Road route. So for monks and people who did not have armies along with them, that is a very dangerous route. Like from the Xinjiang region, the Tarim region, from Kashmir. So that's apparently the route Xuanzang took, as did Fazia before him. But yeah, so go on, Jay.
Yes, and in China today, there's this a famous story of how adventures of Xuanzang, I think, if I'm not wrong. So he comes to India around 629 AD, and he spends 13 years here. And about this period, so for Indian historians, he is the main source, whether we are talking about religious life or whether we are talking about social or administration. So for all of these aspects of history, Xuanzang's account is one of the most primary accounts for us. And interestingly, when in the 19th, 18th century, when most of these ancient history has been was forgotten, and the British officials, was trying to reconstruct this history. So Xuanzang's account became quite important for these British officials. For example, Alexander Cunningham, when he was discovering the important Buddhist sites. So in his travels, Xuanzang he talked about how from this city he traveled this far to the city of Kushinagar, where Buddha had died. So it is analyzing these accounts Alexander Cunningham was able to discover. For example, the city of Kusinara and the location of where the Parinibbana of Gautam Buddha happened. So it is from his account he was able to discover that. And what we see is that we have this record of when finally in 645 he reaches China, Xuanzang. So we are told that he had 645 texts with him, and these texts were carried by 20 horses. So the main aim was for him to to carry as much Buddhist religious text which he was able to.
Yeah. So one of the fascinating things is he seems to have been motivated. So there is this story about how he was reading the Buddhist texts back in China, and he was not convinced about the translations from Sanskrit to Chinese, and that was apparently the motivation for him to come. Unlike the earlier famous traveler Faya, so Faya came to India to find the original Pitaka. He like Wanzang had more wider like interests, not interests but passions, which brought him here. So a lot of history writing for this period, and even for some years before that, comes from Wanzang. So one of the fascinating things he has noted are the Bamiyan Buddhas. So he was the first one to have reported that around so he might have passed the Bamia region from Afghanistan around like 610 or 620, around those times. So the Bamiyan Buddhas would have been already constructed by then. So we exactly don't know who commissioned the Bamiyan Buddhas, but there are some like, but we can be pretty sure that before Xuanzang came, they were like, especially the larger Buddha, he was there.
Right. So, what do we know about the backstory of the Bamiyan Buddhas now that we are talking about them? Uh, what have you read
Not
about them,
not
Jay?
much actually. So
Right.
some people think that the later Hunas have white Huns. So before Tormana, so some scholars they ruled the Gandhar region. So some feel that they patronized it. Some also feel that pre-Islamic Turks. So after the fall of the Hunas, the Western Afghanistan region had some Turks ruling over who were not yet Muslim. So some scholars claim that they patronized it, but I don't think there is consensus. Maybe Jay can add if he knows.
Uh, I think the tough part, especially the tough part is a matter of confusion because the what we know about this Afghanistan region and particularly the 6th century, 7th century Afghanistan is from the Arabic sources, and the Arabic sources have this tendency of calling everyone which they encountered in this eastern frontier of their empire to call everyone Turks. So this is the
Correct.
main point which we have to remember. But most scholars are of the opinion that the later Kushanas or Kidarite Huns, as these some of these were called. So these were not Turks. Uh, this is what some scholars believe. So they were Buddhist and they had constructed this Bamiyan Buddha.
Right. And what do we know about the society and the economy of Harsha's empire? What was the dominant religion? Did they have any trade linkages with Central Asia or China, since they were sending emissaries to China? Was there a large trade conducted with the Chinese empire? What do we know about those aspects of his empire? Jay, would you like to start with that?
Okay. About the society particularly. So as I have said that, this was the period when we see that land grants are being issued. So some scholars have argued that this was the period where feudalism in Indian context, feudalism came into being. Although there is this great debate in history circles about this, but it is true that the overland trade before the coming of the Arabs, particularly in the Sindh region, we see that overland trade has more or less, particularly the sea trade, has disappeared mainly because of the fall of the Roman Empire. So some scholars have talked about the lack of silver coins, which we see in northern India particularly. So this was mainly because of there was no overland trade. And another important thing is that because of this, the northern India especially is fragmented in different kingdoms. We see that the kind of trade that existed before, let's say in the Gupta period, was not there. There was, we can say, some scholars have this view that this period, particularly after the fall of the Guptas, saw the urban decay, saw the in northern India particularly. So this urban decay is linked to the fact that there was no overland trade, and because there was no overland trade, and we have this tendency where the king is giving land to different particularly brahmanas and his officers. So there is this closed economy that is emerging. So this closed economy means that there is no networks of trade. So because there is no networks of trade, urban centers are declining. And since urban centers are declining, we see that the rural population is increasing. So this is one aspect. Although I think we can talk about urban decay in a after some time.
Yeah, so that was also, yeah. So what Harsh just like Jay just said about, yeah, so that seems to be the case. Another interesting thing, so we talked about the Gupta coins and how beautiful they were and how finely crafted they were. So none of the coins of this period are even halfway as good as the Gupta coins were. So definitely there was some financial downturn which had begun during the times of the later Guptas, or like the not the later Guptas per se, but the fag end of the imperial Guptas themselves. So this uh, it might have been, everything might have been linked to the fall of the Roman Empire, and also the Central Asian tribes who were gaining power around this time. So after the Hunas, the Turks, uh, different kinds of Turks started ruling, and maybe this might not have been great for trade, but yeah, we don't know much. One of the things about this urban decay, which Jay just mentioned, that also apparently comes from Xuanzang's account. So he talks about how lot of cities in North India, particularly, were getting emptied, and whereas yeah, so that everything sort of plays together. So some scholars also believe that Brahmanas started migrating south. They were called south. That was also like a domino effect of the urban decay. So uh, so yeah.
Right. So what was the dominating religion of his era? We know we mentioned a little while back that possibly he died as a Buddhist, but what was the religion of the majority of the population of his kingdom?
Yeah, probably. I think I personally don't think that Buddhism or Jainism ever were mass religions per se. So some form of local worship which slowly got integrated into the greater Hindu Vedic traditions. That would be fair to say. But worship of Shiva, Shaivism, seems to be very popular around this time, if I'm not mistaken.
Jay, your thoughts on the religious practices of the empire and the population?
Yes, religious practices also is important during this period, because this was the period, when we see different dynasties, even whether we are talking about northern India or whether we are talking about southern India. There's, this great activity of temple building that is going on. So most of our early temples belong to this period. And so the fact that different dynasties are building temples. So one of the and most of these temples either belong to Lord Vishnu or Lord Shiva. So this building of temples basically tells us that since different dynasties are coming up, so they some scholars have this view that they needed some type of legitimizing what we can say is legitimizing mm,
Of
uh,
course, yeah,
A tool
force.
of
Yes.
yeah,
yeah,
right.
tool of
So
statecraft.
in order for them to have this legitimizing force, they started building temples, so that in the mind of public, they royal it became an important royal center. And most of the time, the priests of these temples were migrating priests who traveled from northern India. And also what we see is that in certain regions, now this is quite controversial, because uh, most people don't believe this, but we also see that integration of tribal religious cult into the larger Hindu pantheon. So most of the time, these temples, what have they also incorporated some tribal elements into their form of worship, and also the main Puranic elements. So
Yeah. So, I mean, this is not popular politically per se, but historically it is pretty robustly attested. So, if you come to Maharashtra region, the popular deities over here, either they are seen as the avatars of Vishnu or Shiv. So, they were like, they most probably were local folk deities who got integrated into the Hindu pantheon. Like, we have Vithoba or Khandoba, who are like the major pilgrimage places from Maharashtra. So that is like, yeah. So I don't think that is historically controversial opinion.
Right. So how does the story end? What happens to Harsha in the end? What happens to his kingdom after he's gone? Gaurav?
So we don't know exactly how he died. So, but we know that he did not have a successor. So probably wars of succession broke out after his death. And one interesting story about Harsha's death is we talked about the Chinese emissaries. So there were these emissaries going back and forth from Harsha to the Tang Emperor, And after one of these emissaries who came back to India came back after death of Harsha, and they were attacked by the ruler of Magad, whose name is actually from Indian sources we don't have his name. Something like from reconstruction of Chinese, it sounds around Arjuna or Sarjuna, something like that. So he apparently attacked the emissaries of the Chinese emperor, and the emissaries had to take help of the Tibetan and Nepalese king to beat back this Magadhan ruler. So, but the Pushyabhuti dynasty seems to have ended very rapidly with Harshvardhan.
Jay, what do you know about this aspect? How does the story end?
Yes, so Harshvardhan dies in 647 AD, and this period of around 50 years after his death, it is some historians call this the dark period of Indian history. There is this from the Chinese sources about which Gauravji has just talked about. Uh, uh, we are there is this some allusion that a certain uh, person has captured the throne of Kannauj, but we are not sure about this. And around the 700 AD, we see that Kannauj again becomes the center of another great king whose name was Yashovarman, and he ruled from 700 to 740 AD.
Right. So the dynasty comes to an end with Harshvardhan. So what's the legacy of this period other than the fact that we've all had a classmate or somebody we know who's named Harsh, Harsha, Harshvardhan? What's the legacy? What are some of the institutions? What are some of the practices? The interesting thing I learned today that he was one of the early patrons of the Prayag Kumbh. What are the other legacies of this era of Harsha in particular?
Yeah. So we talked about this urban decay. Maybe Jay can add some more meat to that topic. But so a large section of scholars think that the feudalism which was dominant in India for the medieval period comes like dates back to this region, this time. So India sort of became, according to that scholarship, became feudal after that. So but I personally like one of the issues of this scholarship is it has a political angle to it. So it has a judgmental view of viewing feudalism as bad. So we can have our own personal opinions, but I think some sort of that has gone into this scholarship. So that is one part of it. One thing which we talked about, North India, particularly after the time of Harsh, never had great like patrons of Buddhism after Harshvardhan. So Buddhism survived in India till the conquests of Muslim Turks, but most probably that was in the Pala after the Pala Empire in the Bengal region and in Gandhar region. So lot of books and lot of scholarship has gone into the why the fall of Buddhism happened, when it did, and when did it start reducing as a popular force of shaping history. But this seems to be like, I would bet that this was the time when especially the heartland of North India sort of went away from Buddhism.
Right. Jay, your final thoughts. What's the legacy of this period?
I think I will talk about urban decay and the decline of Buddhism, because this is the most important in terms of historical legacy of this period, which there is this view of some historians. So urban decay basically, I think R.S. Sharma, which most of us who read history are familiar with him. So R.S. Sharma was the main person who promulgated this idea of urban decay. So in it, he basically argued that by the 300 AD, we see that this urban decline has started to emerge, and by 550 AD, we have, in his view, we can see that urban centers are declining, and depopulation of urban centers is also happening. And for it, he provides the for literary sources particularly. He gives the example of Xuanzang, which Gaurav had talked about. And when it comes to archaeological sources, he provides us different sites from by which he tells us, how before 300 AD these sites were populated. And by after 300 AD, we can see that there is this some these sites are abandoned by these by people who used to reside in these. But but in recent scholarship, this question of urban decay has been challenged. And what we see is that uh, I will name two, three scholars, particularly on the literary aspect. From JNU, there is this professor called Shonalika Kaul. So in her work, she has worked on the kavyas, and what she writes is that when we read the kavyas of early medieval period, particularly this period, which according to R.S. Sharma was the period of urban decline, she believes that when you read kavyas, you will see great descriptions of cities and urban life. So it cannot be possible that we have from the kavyas great description of cities on one hand, and on the other hand, in the archaeological sources, the cities were declining. So new scholarship on archaeological or archaeological evidence particularly tells us that some conclusions of R.S. Sharma was wrong. So, for example, I think I will give example of a site called Besnagar. Besnagar is Vidisha or Bhilsa of today, where we have the Sanchi Stupa. So what we see is that R.S. Sharma tells us that by 300 AD, after 300 AD, Besnagar was abandoned. But interestingly, close to Besnagar, the neighboring site is Vidisha. But in Vidisha, we see that Vidisha continues throughout the early medieval period. So recent scholars believe that we have to look these sites as a type of complex, which consisted of multiple sites. So it is true that some sites were abandoned, but other sites started. They were inhabited, and they were inhabited for a long period of time. Same is true for other sites. For example, Ujjain, Rajghat. Rajghat is a site in Varanasi, and Salihandam is in Andhra Pradesh. So these three sites were mentioned by R.S. Sharma in his example to say that these sites declined after 300 AD. But recent archaeological evidence tells us that that was not the case. So this was urban decay. And about the Buddhism. Buddhism, as Gauravji has said, that Buddhism was never a popular folk religion or which was practiced by masses. And what we see is that if this was the period when Shankaracharya belonged to this period. So in a certain way, what we see is that assimilation of Buddhism in the broader Hindu framework happens. And secondly, this temple building aspect which we have talked about. So temple building and the migration of Brahmanas, these two factors played an important role in the spread of Puranic or Puranic ideas. Because what we see is that when Buddhist monasteries more or less were not attached to the local societies, although they needed resources from these local societies, but there was no interaction per se. But when this migration of the Brahmanas happened, what we see is that these Brahmanas were given land grants in villages or in close to villages. So these Brahmanas were migrating with their families. So there is this cultural assimilation which is going on, which was not present in the case of Buddhism. So this is the broad picture of Buddhism.
Yeah,
Right.
one of the fascinating things around this time about Buddhism is Buddhism also became like it started having parts of Hinduism integrated into some aspects of Buddhism. So that is also one thing. So it may have been like some scholars, particularly a great podcaster on Indian politics called Kit Patrick. He makes this point that for the lay people earlier the differentiation between Hinduism and Buddhism might have been stark, but if there is integration both ways, they might have not understood where Buddhism stops and where Hinduism begins, and that might have been a reason for end of Buddhism. And also the tantric school of Hinduism and Buddhism, that also seems to have risen around this period, especially in the eastern part of the country, Bengal or Bihar region. So I am not particularly well read about Tantra or Tantric Shaivism or Tantric Buddhism either. But the Buddhism which seems to be there in Tibet, that has lot like it. A part of it is seen to be Tantric Buddhism. So that is also a change of sorts around this time.
Right, right. Oh, this is very helpful. Any final comments before we wrap up the episode? Gaurav, Jay?
No, so
Right,
typically this is seen as a time when ancient India per se ends.
right,
So Harshvardhan is seen as the last emperor of ancient India. So
right.
I don't agree with these classifications, but yeah, just telling you what the scholarship says.
Yes, and also in popular reading, after we read about Harsha, at least that's the way NCERT school textbooks normally talk about. North India then sort of starts covering the Rajputs and the early Islamic invasion. This was great stuff, gentlemen.
Uh,
Yes, Jay, any final thoughts, any final comments?
Yes, one thing which I wanted to say is that it was from this period onwards we see that Kannauj becomes an important center, both political as well as religious. And after the fall in the 8th century to 11th century, uh, mm, I think in the later podcast we will discuss about this. That great struggle for the control of Kannauj, started happening. So there's this, great phrase. I think we can end this on that in Chachnama, in order to, say that something is impossible. So the phrase is used is you are asking for Kannauj. So that is how important Kannauj has become.
Right. Well, it continues to be important. One of the prominent political parties of present in North India, Samajwadi Party, I believe, for a long time had a very deep political presence in today's Kannauj, and now at least the Lok Sabha seat is held by the ruling BJP party. So yeah, Kannauj is one of the prominent cities of that era that continues to survive. With this, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you, Jay, thank you, Gaurav, and we look forward to your participation and look forward to our listeners joining us
Tune in next week for Browncast.
in the next episode of the History Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Manish.
Tune in next week for Browncast.